We're following breaking news on the tensions between Canada and the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump has abruptly reversed course on a new trade relationship between Canada and China. Trump had previously supported the recently signed deal, but now he's making fresh tariff threats over that very agreement. Linda is back.
What happens when a single country controls 85% of the one input American agriculture cannot function without, and that country decides to use it? Prime Minister Mark Carney now holds exactly that position over President Trump's tariff regime. Canada supplies roughly 85% of all potash imported into the United States. The United States imports 93% of the potash it consumes. And the math behind that dependency is about to become the most consequential number in American farming. The scale of the imbalance is staggering once you look at the actual production figures. The United States produced roughly 400,000 metric tons of potash in 2023. Domestic potash consumption that same year was approximately 5.3 million metric tons. That is a gap of more than 13 times domestic production. Canada's potash mining scale by production volume was 36 times larger than the United States in 2024. Canada holds 1.1 billion tons of potash reserves, 5 times larger than American reserves, and contributes approximately 32% of global potash production from its Saskatchewan operations alone. When Josh Linville, Vice President of Fertilizer at StoneX, was asked about the risk of disrupting this relationship, his answer was blunt. The problem is, if we start to upset Canada, where else around the world do you start to go? The other suppliers on the list do not solve the problem. Russia supplies 11% of U.S. potash imports, but sanctions and political tensions make that source unreliable. Belarus provides 4% and faces the same geopolitical complications. Israel supplies 3%, but lacks the production capacity to scale into the volume Canada currently provides. None of these alternatives, combined or individually, come close to replacing 85% of U.S. potash supply. The Fertilizer Institute has stated plainly that potash deposits are geographically specific and that mine development in the United States is time-intensive and costly. There is no substitute for potash as an essential plant nutrient. There is no factory that manufactures it. It comes out of the ground, and the ground that has it in commercially viable quantities is overwhelmingly Canadian ground. 5 American states have potash deposits: New Mexico, Utah, North Dakota, Arizona, and Michigan. But these facilities cannot rapidly scale production. Carlsbad, New Mexico has been struggling with lower quality potash for years. The timeline to develop a new potash mine from scratch is measured in years, not months. If Canadian supply were cut off tomorrow, the American facilities capable of producing potash domestically could not expand fast enough to matter for the 2026 growing season, or likely the one after that. Now, consider what that means for the cost structure of American farming. Fertilizer accounts for roughly 30 to 45% of a U.S. farmer's annual operating cost, depending on the crop. For corn specifically, USDA Economic Research Service data shows fertilizer has accounted for 33 to 44% of production costs since 2020, and farmers cannot pass these costs on to anyone. Corn, wheat, and soybeans sell into commodity markets at prices farmers do not control. When fertilizer costs spike, farmers absorb it directly. There's no customer to charge more. This has happened before, and the data from that episode is the preview of what a Canadian potash disruption would look like at scale, relative to the 2010 to 2019 average. Fertilizer costs per acre in 2022 were 110% higher for corn and 141% higher for wheat, driven by the Russia-Ukraine conflict's impact on global fertilizer markets. The U.S. prices paid index tracking farmer input costs rose to 149.9 in June 2025, up from 139.9 the year before, with fertilizer as the primary driver up 11% in that index alone. And even as corn prices have slid from their highs, fertilizer prices have not come down proportionally. That means farmers now need more bushels of corn to afford the same ton of fertilizer than they did before a profitability squeeze that is already active before any potash-specific disruption even begins. The agronomic timing makes this even more dangerous. The large 2025 harvest depleted phosphate and potash reserves from American soil nutrients that must be replenished before the next planting cycle or yields decline. Growers need to restore potash and phosphate levels in their fields specifically to protect 2026 productivity. If Canadian potash becomes unavailable or prohibitively expensive at exactly the moment American farmers need to replenish depleted soil, the yield consequences would not show up immediately. They would show up in the 2026 harvest, when the soil that wasn't properly replenished produces less corn, less wheat, less soybeans across millions of acres simultaneously. The Trump administration's response to farm sector losses so far has been a $12 billion aid package for farmers affected by trade policy losses. But Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins herself described fertilizer input cost inflation as skyrocketing, and $12 billion does not resolve a structural supply shortage. Net U.S. farm income is already forecast to fall by $30 billion. Without Canadian potash, that number deteriorates further, and application rates could fall. As farmers ration the potash, they can still access reducing demand in a way that compounds the yield problem rather than solving it. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, a Republican from one of the largest agricultural states in the country, has already advocated for potash exemptions from tariffs, specifically citing its indispensability. That is not a partisan talking point. That is a senator from a farm country recognizing, ahead of the worst-case scenario, that potash cannot be treated like other tariff-affected goods. Corey Rosenbusch, president and CEO of the Fertilizer Institute, stated that an open, fair, predictable, and transparent trade environment between the US and Canada is vital to supporting a fertilizer industry that meets the needs of American growers, and that restrictions on this cross-border trade drive up costs for farmers, costs that are ultimately felt by consumers at the grocery store. The nitrogen and sulfur numbers add another layer most people miss entirely. Canada supplies nearly 10% of US nitrogen fertilizer needs, accounting for 25% of total US nitrogen fertilizer imports, and nearly 20% of the sulfur American farmers consume. A disruption to Canadian fertilizer trade is not a single nutrient problem. It touches the three primary inputs, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, that together determine whether American soil can sustain commercial-scale crop production at all. In November 2025, the United States formally added potash to its critical minerals list, an official designation defining it as strategically essential to the country. And yet Canada, America's primary source of that critical mineral, remains the target of the same tariff regime that triggered this entire standoff. Carol McKeown, a professor of land and food systems at the University of British Columbia, described an export ban scenario as kind of like going to the nuclear option, and noted that consumers may not see the price impact immediately because the cost increases take time to work through the food supply chain before reaching grocery store shelves. The current potash market is split into two realities. Globally, prices are relatively soft because of increased Russian supply reaching international buyers. Domestically, the American market is entirely dependent on Canadian tonnage, and that dependency is the epicenter of the risk. American producers like Intrepid Potash exist, but their production capacity is nowhere near sufficient to meet national demand on their own. The strategy of using tariffs to pressure Canadian trade was meant to protect American interests. Instead, it has handed Canada a form of leverage over American food security that no amount of tariff revenue can offset. Fall applications for the 2026 season are roughly 7 months away. That is the window during which this entire standoff plays out, and American farmers are the ones positioned to absorb whatever happens next.